Oh.
Great. It looks like we have a number of folks already logged on, and I'll hand the mic over to Michael Katz, CEO and co-founder of mParticle. Enjoy the session.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited for this conversation today. I'm going to be talking with one of my favorite people, as well as authors, someone I'm lucky enough to get to work with on a consistent basis. So, Annie, not that you need any introduction, but I'm going to open up by sharing your background. And then when I screw it up, please feel free to correct me or add anything that's relevant. Sound good?
I have faith. I have faith.
Cool. Okay, I love it. You grew up in New Hampshire.
True.
Live free or die.
Live free
You
or
ended up
die.
going to perfect, 1 for 1. You ended up going to college at Columbia, and then went on to pursue a doctorate at UPenn. Okay. You got into playing poker shortly thereafter. Your brother was also a professional poker player. Okay.
Yeah, we're like 100% so far. This is great.
I love it. I did my research.
Yeah.
You are also a former World Series of Poker champion, correct?
Yes.
Winning your first bracelet in 2004. Okay. You've gone on to write a couple of my favorite books, Thinking in Bets and How to Decide. And you're currently in the process of writing your third book, to be named later. And somewhere in there, you were a finalist on Celebrity Apprentice.
Yes, well, that's one of the weirder things in my bio, but that is true.
I love it. And then most importantly, of all the facts, of all the background, we get to work together day in, day out, where you help me, to quote Chi, our Chief Product Officer, suck a little less every day.
I hope that part is true. That one I can't verify, but I hope that part is true.
So I know I skipped over a ton. What else should people know?
That was pretty good. I have, I've 4 great kids. That's the only thing I think I would add. So, but that was excellent. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we're going to cover a whole bunch of ground today, from how to make decisions to using data to we may dive into complexity theory or chaos theory. It may get a little weird, but we're going to have some fun.
Yes.
So let's center the conversation a little bit. What we really want to talk about is innovation, and successfully adapting to change along the way, all in service of growth, of course. So we're talking about innovation, but in order to innovate, we have to back up. So let's kind of build up to it. Innovation is effectively a prediction, right? The ability to innovate, though, requires explanation, because strong prediction begins with better explanation. And so people have been able to innovate because of our ability to seek out the truth and ultimately create better explanations of the world around us. And so part of seeking better explanations is the separation between true knowledge and authority, right? So that's to say, like, our understanding of the world around us requires us to constantly challenge the status quo, reject quote unquote norms, and operate more off of first principles. So the first question for you, the question around innovation and what is required ultimately for better explanation.
Oh gosh, that's a big one. There was a lot.
It is a big one.
To that in terms of status quo and authority and so on and so forth. So let me start sort of going back to first principles, which is we need to sort of roll it all the way back to the core, which is what determines how things turn out. And there's two things that determine how things turn out for you. One is luck. So you can make perfectly good decisions, and sometimes it will go for you and sometimes it will go against you. So that then dealing with luck starts to become part of the prediction, not in the sense that you have any control over luck. So when people say things like, I make my own luck, that actually doesn't make any sense, because luck by definition is something that you can't make. You don't have control over it. What you can do is make decisions that will cause a higher probability of good outcomes for you than bad outcomes for you. But which outcome you actually observe on any given time is solely due to luck, something that you don't have control over. So if we're thinking about prediction, the luck piece is just being able to see that clearly. In other words, as you're examining different options or you're examining a particular option and you're trying to figure out how you think it might turn out, you need to be able to see the luck clearly. Like you need to know that the coin is going to flip heads 50% of the time and tails 50% of the time. And you closer you get to truth on that, the better you're going to be at predicting, because you're going to understand over time which outcomes you happen to be observing. But then there's the second piece of what determines how really your life turns out. And that has to do with the quality of your decisions. How good are your decisions? So obviously, in order to make great decisions, you have to see luck accurately. But the other piece of that is just what is the quality of knowledge that's going into the decisions that you're making. So we can think about the facts or the knowledge that we have as the foundation of every decision that we make. And there's generally two problems with that foundation. The first is that there are things that we believe to be true, mental models that we have, things that we think about in terms of the way that we explain the world that just are inaccurate in some way, not necessarily totally inaccurate, but somewhere from somewhat inaccurate to completely inaccurate. So let's call that cracks in the foundation. And then the other thing is there's just a whole world of stuff that we don't know, right? So, and the more facts we don't know, the more other perspectives we don't have. Obviously, our ability to predict what's going to happen in the future is going to suffer for that. So let's say that our foundation is flimsy. So really what we're trying to do in order to really improve decision-making is to improve the quality of the knowledge that we have. And then on top of that, improve our ability to explain or model that information that we have in order to be able to predict the future. So that we can think about if I make a particular decision or if I do a particular action, these are the set of outcomes that are likely to occur. And this is the probability with which I think those will happen. And that is what creates a good decision. So at its essence, a decision is just a prediction of the future. And that's the thing that we have to keep in mind. So how do we become better predictors, basically?
Yeah.
Does that answer your question in any way? It was a lot to unpack.
It did. The part around quality of knowledge certainly rings true, especially for what we do here at mParticle. Ultimately, it's about the quality and the cleanliness of the data, which are the building blocks for the quality of high quality knowledge. But I really like what you had to say around luck, because ultimately, like, high quality decisions or like good decisions can lead to bad outcomes.
Yes. And
bad decisions can also lead to good outcomes. So how do you start to think about reconciling those two phenomena?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really big problem. And what's interesting is if I tell you that in regards to something that is settled, right? That where we know we already have all agreed what a good decision is. So let's take something really simple like a traffic light. Right? We know that it's a good decision to go on green and it's a bad decision to go on red. So that's totally settled. We already know that. There's no uncertainty about that. So in that particular case, you can see very clearly, well, sometimes when I go on green, I can still get in an accident. Like we all kind of know that. And also sometimes when I go on red, nothing happens to you, you're fine. Which has happened to me accidentally. I've not done it on purpose, but accidentally. I imagine we have all run red lights or run a stop sign or those kinds of
Not
things.
me.
Never, right? And gotten through unscathed. Okay, so when it comes to that, we kind of understand that if I said to you, oh, I got in an accident, that it would be hard for you to determine whether it was my fault or not. In other words, was it my decision quality or not until you had more information. We kind of understand it was something like that. The problem is that for most things, they aren't very traffic light-esque. Or like, as I talk about, they're not very chess-like, they're more poker-like, right? So in chess, where you can see there's no hidden information, right? So that's that quality of information problem. You can see where all the pieces are. And there's also not a strong influence of luck in the sense that nobody like rolls dice and then you're in check, or, you get a 7 and you get an extra bishop or something like that. Like the pieces are going to stay where they are until they're moved by an active skill. You always know why somebody lost. They lost because they made worse decisions, and you can actually go back and find where that decision is, right? So it's interesting. Like, even if I haven't watched the two people play, if I know that one person lost, I know for a fact their decisions were worse, right? So in that particular case, it lines up perfectly between outcomes and decision quality. So in poker, though, it's different, and life is very poker-like, right? In poker, I can lose because of luck. I can't see the other player's cards. So I'm trying to model the other player in a particular way that will be predictive of what their future actions are going to be. So I'm taking in all of this data. What do they do? How often do they play? So on and so forth, ultimately to try to figure out what their hole cards are, because that explanation allows me to reveal information that isn't immediately obvious because things get connected together. And then that helps me be a better predictor. But the problem with living in that uncertainty is that if I lose, it's very hard for you to know why. And if I win, it's very hard for you to know why. But we have a tendency to believe that if I won, it must have been because I played well. And if I lost, it must have been that I played poorly. But that's a really bad mistake. That's called resulting. So just taking the result and assuming that lines up, the quality of the result lines up with the quality of the decision. So the way that we deal with that is to actually start to create a really good record of why we believed what we do. So that's going to include both really high quality data so that we understand what was the information that was being inputted from a data standpoint into the decision, right? And then how did we model that? So we understand what were we predicting would happen over time. And now I can start to look at that and say, from that standpoint, as I look across, what were the different possible outcomes and what did I think the upside or downside for those outcomes were? I can now know, was that a good decision or bad decision, separate and apart from a single outcome that I might observe. And really, that's the only way to do it, is to get really focused on process. And in order to get really focused on process, then you have to get really focused on data quality, explanation, and recording those things to create prediction.
Yep. And I would imagine that in order to close the gap effectively and consistently, what you really also need are really tight feedback loops, because the longer the feedback loop, the greater the likelihood is for there to just be a number of like subsequent issues, people overcompensating or whatever else may happen. So that speed of information and the tightness of the feedback loop is critically important. Fair?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's incredibly important. And obviously when I was playing poker, I was getting feedback all the time. It was very, very fast, within about 2 minutes, right? So sometimes I could get to see my opponent's hand at the end of the hand, and then I could sort of map that on to whether I sort of had them right. I was making predictions about whether they would fold or raise, so on and so forth, because I had an explanation for why that opponent behaved the way they did. And then when I saw them do something that was unexpected, given my model of them, then that would tell me to go and adjust my model. So if I predicted that my opponent would probably had this particular type of hand, and if I raised, they would probably fold, and they didn't do that, they did something really different than what I expected, that would be very quick feedback to tell me that I need to think about whether I actually had them modeled properly. And one of the things that really separated great poker players from merely good ones was that they were willing to alter those models very quickly based on that type feedback. And I think that that's something that we underestimate. When we think about status quo, for example, status quo is very strong. The way that you've thought about the world in the past, the way our cognition works, the way that we think about the world is to reinforce those models that we bring into the situation. And we will actually discount data or highlight data in order to preserve our original model of the world. So if we take that poker example and a player all of a sudden raises where I think they were supposed to fold, what I'll do is say things like, well, that was an anomaly. You know, my model is right. They just did something weird. Okay, so that's that sort of reinforcement of the status quo that we definitely don't want to have happen, and it does. And so that requires that you actually pay attention to that feedback, number one, and number two, that you work really hard to tighten the feedback loops, right? So one of the things that we don't want to do is say, well, the outcome that I'm looking for is like in a month, right? So in poker, I could say, what I really care about is, am I winning month over month? So that's going to give me these very long feedback loops that's going to make me slow to adjust my game. But if instead I actually start to think like within hand, like this model predicts that in the short run, these particular things will happen. Then you can get to a point where you're actually creating really tight feedback loops. One of my favorite examples actually comes from early stage venture to sort of highlight this idea. So with early stage venture, they always say, well, the outcome that I'm looking for is a company that reaches escape velocity, right? That becomes a unicorn, that becomes that multi-billion-dollar company. So that happens like 10 years later. And so what am I supposed to do? My feedback loops are really long. But let's say that you're an investor at, say, seed. You don't have to live with that long feedback loop, because you can start predicting things that are going to happen in the interim, like what's the probability it will fund its Series A with a top tier lead. That's going to happen in this market within 6 months. And all of a sudden now, instead of a 10-year feedback loop, you've created for yourself a 6-month feedback loop that then starts to tell you whether your explanation, whether your model of the world is actually comporting with what's happening in the future, gets you to be a better predictor before you have to wait for that like very long-term outcome to occur.
Right. Well, and we all have multiple models, right? And so part of like our knowledge and our worldview is ultimately almost subconsciously like a scan of all of our models, right? But the better the model, is it fair to say that it produces confirmation without conflict? Is that the right way to think about it? Whereas imperfect models may provide some confirmation, but not without conflict. And so they fall down over time.
Yeah, so that actually brings up a really interesting point, which is, I feel like when people are doing process dives, when they're actually trying to look at whether their models are good or bad, what they tend to do is just look at when you got a bad outcome. So, so in other words, like something went wrong, you lost, something happened, and now you're saying, let's go do a process dive, right? But that's actually not helpful for the reason that you're talking about. There's other reasons that it's not helpful that have to do with reinforcing the status quo, which we can dive into if you want to. But in this particular case, bad outcomes are often not unexpected, not in terms of what your model is saying, right? So for example, I could have a model that says 80% of the time I'm going to get a great outcome and 20% of the time I'm going to get one that I don't like. Well, if I get one that I don't like, that's actually not that informative. So now I'm doing a process dive that isn't actually going to help me because it doesn't conflict with what my model said that would happen. That's the problem. And so that's the problem with, it's one of the problems because there's many, with only queuing in, doing your process dives, checking in on your model, seeing if you need to update based only on bad outcomes. Instead, what we want to do is identify what is conflict. In other words, what do I expect to see over time in terms of behavior of a customer, in terms of behavior of a company, in terms of at the poker table, in terms of behavior of my opponent, right? And then if I can be very specific about what I expect to see given my model over a variety of different domains or behaviors, then when something unexpected happens, that's when I would dive into my model. And the good news is that then you're only queuing in on that prediction piece that we talked about. You've predicted certain things will occur. If something unexpected happens, now I care. And notice here, what's really important at that is there's all sorts of unexpected good stuff that happens. So, you know, the way that we sort of work in the business environment today is if like you have, for example, a target and you miss it by 15%, there's this big process dive that occurs. But what happens when you exceed it by 15%? Everybody's patting themselves on the back and having champagne, but we would assume that that would be equally unexpected as the flip side. And now you're not able to go in and say, well, that was actually very unexpected. That was actually conflict. We don't process it as conflict because it was a good outcome, but it was conflict in regards to your model. And you ought to go in and see what you can learn from that and try to figure out why you're, was it just an outlier, or did my model actually not take into account that the upside was so big? Maybe I missed some risk, whatever it might be, but that's what you should be queuing in, is on the conflict part, not the good or bad part.
Yes. So we're operating off, or more appropriately, from the idea that better explanation leads to better understanding, which is the primary requirement for growth and innovation.
That's right.
I'd also propose, like, we can probably all agree that along the way, throughout the course of the day, we find ourselves having to make judgment calls, and ultimately, like, better decisions lead to better outcomes. But oftentimes we're just taking guesses, right? Like, we're trying to make the best guess possible, or maybe, dare I say, like, we're all just placing bets. Is that fair?
I think that's totally fair. So
Yeah.
I have said, I've been known to say that every decision is a bet.
Yes.
So,
You wrote a book about it.
I did. It's called Thinking in Bets. Weird. National bestseller on every decision is a bet. So here's what I want to think about, right? When we're talking about uncertainty, what we're really talking about is complexity. And as far as this sort of understanding this idea of bets, you're making bets when you're operating under uncertainty, right? When the world is stochastic, just meaning there's luck involved, just a super fancy academic world for, hey, there's luck. And when you're, what we would say in an academic sense, operating behind the veil of ignorance. What does that mean? That there's just information that you don't know. So let me sort of try to go back to the chess and poker to understand complexity. So there's lots of decisions that are complicated. And complicated means there's a lot of steps and a lot of moving pieces to them, but you don't have the uncertainty. So chess is the perfect example of a very complicated decision, meaning there's lots of different pieces, there's lots of different available moves to you. As you think about any move that you might make, what are the moves that your opponent could then respond with, so on and so forth, right? So that's a very complicated decision, but we know it's solvable. And that's the difference. So complicated decisions are solvable. They're hard because there's a lot of pieces to them. It's not tic-tac-toe, which is pretty simple, but we know that it's solvable because computers solved it a long time ago with Big Blue. They just brute force the game till the end. Because there isn't a strong influence of luck and you're not operating behind the veil of ignorance in the same way, you can see all the pieces. But once you get to something like poker, you start talking about complex decision-making. And this is true of anything, whether it's customer behavior or investment, or who am I hiring into a role? Or who am I going on a date with, or who am I marrying? These are all very complex decisions where there's lots and lots and lots of hidden information, meaning there's luck that can happen, but then there's also just lots of stuff that we don't know. Some stuff we know we don't know, some stuff we don't know we don't know. And that creates a lot of complexity, meaning that ultimately it's not solvable in the same sense that a chess game is solvable, where you can do some mathematical calculation and just brute force that. Now, what ends up happening when people confront complex decisions is one of two things. Either they go to essentially just straight guessing, meaning I'm just going to go with my gut, and whatever my gut tells me, I'm going to go do. Now, the problem with just sort of going with your gut and just saying what your gut tells, doing what your gut tells you to do, is that your gut is not available for examination. And I hope that what everybody has heard here is that in order to actually be able to parse out and improve your models of the world, you have to be able to examine those models once you sort of see how the world starts to unfold. And if you just go with your gut, you haven't exposed anything in terms of poking at it and saying what your first principles are, what your rationale is, what your explanation is for why you believe what you do. So that's one way that people react to it, is I'll just go with my gut. The other way people react to it is to treat it like it's a complicated decision instead of a complex one. In other words, and we all know this, is to keep spinning and asking people's opinions and trying to model and model and model and model and model until they get to, like, you know, they think they can get to 100% certainty about the decision, and they're really afraid to ever act. Instead of saying, I've got really good data, this is sort of the best explanation I have right now. I realize if I get more information, I'm probably not going to change my mind. And the slower I go, the slower I am to innovate. So time is a really valuable resource here. So what you need to do is find the sweet spot where you're willing to go at like 70, 60, 70% certainty between I'm just going to wing it and I'm going to treat it like it's chess or a complicated mathematical decision where I somehow can come up with the exact answer. And instead, you need to live in the in-between, which is, given my knowledge now and the quality of the explanation that I believe that I've gotten to, I need to push it out. And then ultimately push that out with a set of expectations for how things are going to behave, given what my explanation is, given what my model of this data is, and then create those feedback loops to start iterating on that.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And so depending on which environment you may find yourself in, if it's complicated or complex or potentially even chaotic, there's a set of steps, but the order by which you execute those steps will probably change, right? I think it's the Cynefin framework, which says, like, it's, you know, observe, orient, decide, and analyze. And based on known knowns and unknown unknowns, or known unknowns or unknown knowns, you have to sequence your steps, or like the order of operations effectively. That's kind of what you're saying.
That's correct. And then on top of that, how much certainty you feel you need to have in order to act is going to be really different in the different environments. Right. So, and I think that that's something that's really important. It's like, we need to realize that we don't want to make that mistake, right? People talk about paralysis by analysis, right? That's because you're treating a complex decision as complicated. So that's why you have to separate those out, because otherwise you're asking yourself to reach a standard that you actually can't reach. And then actually what's really interesting is if we go back to that problem of, remember I said, like, most process dives are triggered by a bad outcome, not by an unexpected one. That actually starts to reinforce that behavior, where people start to continue to think about and seek feedback and get approvals up the chain and so on and so forth, beyond the point at which the decision is already obvious, given your state of knowledge and the quality of the model that you already have to explain the data. And one of the reasons you can see that happens is that, as much as we talk about blameless postmortems, right? And then a postmortem is obviously triggered by a bad outcome. If that's the only thing you're doing is postmortems, then blameless is just a word that you put in front of that, that becomes empty, because the people in the room are still being asked to defend their actions, and they understand that. And so there are two great defenses. One is, look at all of the time I took on the decision. Look at all the approvals that I got on the decision. Look how many people signed off on it. Look how many people gave input. Look how many, I kept getting more and more and more and more and more and more information. That's a great defense in that room against the blameless postmortem. She should just drop that word because it doesn't work. But the other thing, and this goes back to the beginning of the conversation, is that, you know what else is a great defense in that room is the status quo. Mm-hmm. I followed procedure. Yeah. I did things.
This is how it's always done.
This is how it's always done. And everybody goes, yeah, what could you do? It's the way it's always done. And what's interesting is that when we get into those non-status quo decisions, what happens, and I think we see this in the startup world in particular, is that when people have some kind of outsized great outcomes that was done through some sort of innovation, they get called a genius. But here's the problem. When they have a bad outcome that's from something that veers from the status quo, then they're an idiot, right? Then they're, how could you do that? You're so dumb. Why did you do that? And the problem is that as much as we all like to be called geniuses, we much prefer not to be called idiots by a lot, almost 2 times. It's almost 2 times more painful to be called an idiot than it is happy to be called a genius. And so you're pushing people with those blameless postmortems instead of cueing on expectations, instead of cueing on, does it conflict with the model, right? What you're doing is you're reinforcing the status quo, and you're also reinforcing analysis by paralysis. Both of those are super, super, super bad. And then the third thing you're reinforcing, which is also really bad, is you're getting people to be incrementalists. In other words, if I only do something a little bit different, I'm probably not going to get anything too bad or too good. Right. And so while that protects the individual, that doesn't help with innovation. And a lot of times leadership is creating that environment without knowing it. And I think recently, like, people have sort of figured out that maybe because they have just recently added this word blameless to the postmortem, but I'm just letting everyone know you can't make a postmortem blameless. It's impossible.
Yeah, well, I think the notion there is to focus on the what, not the who, but inevitably, in my experience, there's a strong gravity to bring in the.
Well, the problem is there's a who did the what.
Well, exactly. Exactly.
But to your point, it's about conflict, right? It's like, does it conflict with the model? Because if it conflicts with the model, what happens is you're going to ignore a lot of bad stuff and you're going to ignore some good stuff. But some of the good stuff you're really going to cue in on and start doing these big process dives. And some of the bad stuff you're going to cue on and you're going to do these big process dives. And then when you tell someone, I care about the process, I just want to dig in and make sure that our explanations are really good, they start to believe you because that's the way you're actually behaving. And then on top of that, you stop reinforcing the status quo. You get people to be willing to move faster, to be more innovative, to own their own decisions more. And you stop all this learning loss and you improve your predictive capabilities. Like, there's a lot of good stuff that comes from that. Yeah.
Yep. I agree. And so if we maybe kind of just like pan out a little bit, we talk about like organizational dynamics. Like, organizations are complex systems made up of a number of subsystems, right? The functions, who each have their own system, where the structure, the incentives, the people, the personalities all end up kind of driving behaviors that end up leading to nonlinear outcomes. And so I think we have to recognize that in one group, an action, a decision, an outcome has significant influence over other parts of the system, where they impact the system as a whole, right? And so part of it is how the system functions, the information, the type of communication. The other is the culture, right? Like, the culture to me is always like the structural capacity to be able to have the right type of conversation, to pursue the right type of answers. And it's also like not always that simple, right? Because almost always, as we were just talking about, you're going to have imperfect information, and even when you have like good information, then you have like group dynamics at play, right? So we all, and this is one big thing where you've helped us a ton. You get a lot of people with a lot of opinions, all who are really passionate about the success of the company, the growth of the organization. And then the discourse amongst the group just becomes like completely chaotic. And so how do you think about this? Like, as like cutting through or sorting through like the noise, the bias, and then after that, as a follow-up, talk about like the maybe lack of signal or kind of like weak signal in terms of making good decisions.
So let me tackle the first one, and then maybe you'll have to remind me of the second question when
Perfect.
we get to it. Yeah. So so organizations are very complex. They are not complicated. For sure, they are complex.
Mhm.
Hopefully they're not chaotic. We don't want them to get too chaotic. That would be really bad. Sometimes they're chaotic, but hopefully not always. But when you look at the scientific literature in terms of two things, which is bias reduction, and then also noise reduction. So let me just explain what the two are, just the difference between the two. So bias is like, imagine that you have a target and a shooting target, right? We all know that with the bullseye and the rings. And you're shooting at it and the gun has a bent, it's bent in some way, or the sight is off. What will happen is that you're going to miss the bullseye, but always sort of in the same place on the target, right? Because the sight is off, and it's off in a way that is very predictable. So that's like bias, right? So we know, for example, that people will consistently underestimate the amount of time it will take to deliver a project. So that's called the planning fallacy. You're smiling because I'm sure that you've had this problem before. Never. So that's bias, right? We know exactly what direction it's going to go in is that people are going to underestimate. Either they're going to think they can deliver it faster, and that's going to be consistent pretty much across people. So that would be, it's in the overconfidence range, but confirmation bias, that's always happening in a certain direction, which is we tend to confirm our beliefs, not disconfirm them. So that's like having a bent barrel, or like a sight that's off. So that's bias. But then there's also noise. And noise would be that I don't know how to aim at all. And essentially you could imagine that you're shooting all over the target. Okay, so you're missing, in both cases, you're missing the bullseye, but in one case you can predict how you're going to miss it. In the other, it's just noisy. In other words, it's pretty kind of random across. So this is a good sort of explanation for an organization. So each individual is going to have certain biases, right? So that's going to have to do with, for example, like their explanations for the world, right? Like different people will have different explanations or different mental models that would explain, for example, customer behavior. And if they have different mental models, that's going to cause them to have different predictions. But those predictions are going to tend to be consistent. So because they're bringing their own model into it. So if there's an error, they're going to be consistent in the type of error they're making in terms of predicting, say, customer behavior, right? So that's bias, right? But across the organization, everybody has different models. So that's going to create noise, right? Because my prediction is going to look different than your prediction is going to look different than your prediction, and so on and so forth. So the question is, how do we sort of solve for that problem? And it turns out we solve for that problem in exactly the same way. So if I want to discipline my bias, it's really good for me to get your perspective on the world, right? So basically, one thing that diversity brings to the table is different perspectives on the world, and those perspectives discipline each other. So I might be biased in a particular way, but if I find out what you think, that's going to allow me to see the world from your perspective, which should act as a debiasing mechanism. But then also on top of that, it also helps to reduce noise, because what they found is that if you have people who are really well informed predicting something, and then you allow those predictions show through, and either if it's a number, you can average those, or if it's a prediction about like, who should I hire, or what do we want to do in terms of a strategic initiative, if you have them talk about it, it will create a less noisy decision. So that's sort of the thing, is how do you actually get people's opinions in a way that's pretty unvarnished, so that I know exactly what you think and you know exactly what I think. And the answer to that is don't do it in a group setting. So that's cueing back in on what you said of like, but when you get them all together, it can become quite chaotic, and there's a lot of actual noise as opposed to the cognitive noise that I'm talking about. And people are sort of talking over each other and trying to convince each other. Leadership will hold more sway, subject matter experts will hold more sway, and sometimes they're the most guilty of reinforcing the status quo, because they have their expertise at stake, right? So what we do at mParticle is, when we have a question that is important, you wouldn't do this for a small question, but a big question, is we get structured feedback from each member of the group independently. And that's true whether we're brainstorming something or we're trying to think about what the next year's goals are supposed to be, or we're trying to think about who you hire, or if we're trying to think about at the core, like what should the values of the organization be, for example. You get that feedback independently from everybody. And now that reduces the chaos because you've actually seen what all the different opinions are. You've allowed people to disagree with each other without any conflict because they don't know they're disagreeing with each other. And that then allows you to guide the conversation around the most important things in a way that reduces the bad kind of conflict.
Yep. Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing, and also I've very much seen it firsthand, is that you want to remove noise, like literal noise and cognitive noise, to create a greater level of intentionality, because that's how you ultimately create more predictable outcomes. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then it also allows you to walk around the decision in a better way. So when we're thinking about that issue of hidden knowledge, some of that hidden knowledge is also that I don't know other people's perspectives on the problem. And also I don't know the facts that live in other people's heads. So when you try to elicit this information in a group setting, what happens is that some voices get drowned out, or you just don't have time to expose what everybody's perspectives are, what their mental models are, what their explanations are, the data that they might have at hand. And this allows that all to be exposed. So when you're thinking about that problem of the foundation of every decision, some of the things you believe are inaccurate, and then also there's a whole bunch of stuff you don't know, this actually strengthens the foundation of every decision you make, because you can walk around the decision. I can see everybody's perspective, and and then I learn a whole bunch of stuff, some of which I knew I didn't know, but I also learned stuff that I didn't know. And that's really at the base of every great decision that you ever make.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And so I know we're kind of coming up on time. I want to transition this a little bit. We've obviously talked about various states, including complication and complexity, and maybe even chaos, as well as the need to make good decisions along the way in the face of limited or imperfect information. And so I'm going to try to summarize this a little bit, but the building blocks start with having good, high quality, clean data to drive a better understanding. We have to create tighter integrated feedback loops to make better decisions. One thing we didn't talk about, though, is like the overall governance of this stuff, right? How do you think about governance in the context of everything we've talked about? Or will a properly constructed and well-run system just naturally lead to better governance?
Really good question. Okay, so let me take a second with that. I think it's a combination of the two. I think that a really well-run system is going to lead certainly to better governance, but in order to do that, it's a little circular, because you have to have really clear owners. You have to have people who are driving the decisions that you're trying to make. Because otherwise, I think if you don't do that, if you think about the process, for example, that I just outlined, where you're really trying to think about who are the right people to be eliciting feedback from in terms of this decision, whose judgments really matter to us. Because, you know, one of the things that we need to remember about data, and we've touched on this a lot, is that data without explanation isn't particularly useful. So you need really high quality data, but you need really high quality explanation. And that explanation is a model of that data. And two different people can look at the same data and come up with different explanations for one thing. So we'd like to land on the right explanation, but then also two people can look at the explanation and come up with different things that you're supposed to then do with that. right? So, and that's going to depend on things like risk tolerance, right? How willing are you to make a risky decision or not, for example? So I can be looking at the exact same output from great data and a great explanation, and I could come up with a different conclusion than you do. So we need to think as we're trying to make those subjective judgments, because there's always a subjective judgment, and don't fool yourself that there isn't. There's a subjective judgment to every, something to every decision. There's subjective qualities to it. Who are the right people to offer those subjective judgments? And then someone has to drive, like, what is the feedback that we're trying to get? Sometimes you need to elicit the feedback you're trying to get from the group. In other words, to say, what do you think the important pieces of this decision are as a start? In other words, don't tell me what you think of them. Right. So maybe if you're like an investor, it's like, we really care about market. We really care about product. We really care about the founder. If it's this case, we really care about certain customer behaviors, right? Where these are the things that we really think we need to be predicting, for example, in order to really drive our business forward. Right. In poker, it's things like, it really matters to me, how often does someone enter a pot? How likely are they to raise? How susceptible are they to pressure? So I can sort of create that structure. And then if I'm trying to think about how do I actually elicit those judgments, who do I then elicit those judgments from? I have to be driving that. And then how do I integrate those? How do I then bring those back to the group to have really good structured, facilitated discussion around that doesn't involve people trying to convince each other? How do I decide what is the process for making a decision? These are all really, really important, right? Sometimes it's one decider, sometimes it's majority rule. As long as it's not unanimous, I don't care. I don't like any unanimous decisions. MK knows that. But so that's sort of like that governance piece, right? That you have to have somebody sitting on top of that who's being the driver of this, who's making sure that these things are going forward. But as you start to put these processes in place, then good governance emerges out of it as well.
Yes. Yep. That to me makes a ton of sense. Like, better quality data leads to better explanation, which leads to better prediction, which leads to innovation and growth. And seems like the underpinnings of all that are data quality, strong governance, and faster, kind of quicker integrated feedback loops, which I think is kind of core to a lot of the things that we do at mParticle, and certainly things that we're passionate about. I know we have about 10 minutes left here, and I think we wanted to save some time for audience Q&A. So, Lindy, I'm not sure if you're going to moderate the Q&A, but I will defer to you.
Wonderful. Thank you both for the conversation. So we've had one question come in, and I think this is one for both of you. How do you say no when there seems to be a long list of priorities, a lot of data, as well as to-do lists that seem to be coming out your ears?
So this is a question of how do you figure out what to say no to?
I believe so.
Okay. So there's a couple of pieces of this. Well, I don't know. MK, do you want to take this one first?
I can. My belief on this in terms of setting priorities, like at a high level, is that the thing that hurts companies in terms of their ability to execute is not lack of good ideas. It's the over pursuit of too many good ideas and not leaving enough capacity to pursue great ideas. So it's one part prioritization, it's another part resource allocation. But I would probably go back to a lot of the stuff that we actually just talked about. And I think about when it comes to making decisions and ultimately what we need to do, what we can support. I think about what is the potential impact? What is my confidence that it will create that impact? And then you have the whole kind of like one-way, two-way door thing where you're ultimately deciding is, do I need speed or do I need precision? And if it is probably more precision, the implication is going to be it's probably going to take longer and it's going to require more capacity. And yeah, I don't know if I can necessarily articulate how I reconcile all of those things, but those are the things that I think about when I'm trying to decide what to say yes or what to say no to.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, so I think that's great. So so let me just cue in on something that you talked about, which is impact and optionality. So the first thing is to say to yourself, with a particular, any particular option that you're thinking about pursuing, what is the impact on the organization going to be, both in two senses, right? If we get it right, what will be the upside impact, but also if we get it wrong, how bad is the downside impact? So you want to think about those two things together. And then the other thing you want to think about is how easy is it to reverse something, to undo it. So this would be the two-way versus one-way door piece. Now, what ends up happening with a lot of these types of decisions, and so that's how we would create our stack. So in other words, like super low impact, easy to reverse stuff, you can do a lot of that. It's not taking up a lot of people's times. Incrementally across all of those decisions that you make, it will actually move things forward, and they're small. So it's not a big deal. Where you have to get into this big priority setting is this is going to be high impact. If it doesn't work out, it's going to be really bad for us. And it's going to be hard to undo. And that's where you need to bring in lots of perspectives in order to set priorities. And that has to be done as group work. Now, here's the really important thing, though, that I want to say to this, which is sometimes people fall into a trap when they're thinking about impact and optionality, is that they don't think, what do I need to know? What don't I know right now that's going to help me understand what the impact, whether this is something that's worth pursuing, whether it's going to be great as opposed to good, which I think is such a great way to think about it, right? So you're trying to figure out what's the information that I need to collect. But most people don't do this. Instead, they think about it as deploying the whole package and not thinking about what's the small thing that I can do. So an example that I had from that I thought was really good is when you're in a digital environment, so let's say, for example, that you're using tax software, you're creating tax software. What tends to happen with tax software is you'll get all sorts of things that customers want to change, and some of those would be great strategic priorities, but they're really big and hard to undo. And so what ends up happening is that when people sort of explore what the downside of that and the fact that it's not particularly reversible if you implement it across the whole system, across the whole customer database, then they just won't do it. But they forget that there's always a third option, which is, can we do this in a small way that's going to get us the information that we need in order to know whether we can actually execute and whether it's worthwhile to implement this across the whole customer base. And what you would do is then create a very hermetically sealed environment with like a handful of 50 customers or whatever that you would then develop that into, that doesn't touch the data from your main customer base, for example. So we always want to be thinking about that separate question, which is, as I'm trying to sort through these big priorities that are hard to reverse and very big impact, how can I sort of maximize for the amount of information that I can get for the lowest effort in order to find out whether this is worthwhile? Now, believe it or not, this is something that we do in poker all the time. So in poker, people think that bluffs are like these really big, like all-in moments where I put like hundreds of thousands on the table with nothing in my hand out of the blue. But I don't actually do that. When I was talking about all this modeling of my opponents, most of that modeling comes from very small bets in low risk situations that don't risk a lot of money, that aren't going to have a big effect on me, but they're very strategically placed because they help me test my model. They help me figure out if something I'm thinking about doing will be great as opposed to good. And when I make those tiny little bets that just, are placed just to get my opponent to give me an answer that helps me build my model, that's what then allows me to go all in later with confidence. And that's what we want to think about when we're stacking. Like, what do we say yes to and what do we say no to? One of the best ways to do that is to say, when we're thinking about these priorities, assuming they're all relatively equal in impact, which of these can I get information about in a really quick, low friction, easy to reverse way? And that is the thing that you should prefer. And go find out that information. And then that's going to inform your decision about what's going to be great. I hope that makes sense.
I think that's a great answer. Thank you both. Here's another question. Annie, in your experience in poker, how did you build a threshold to make decisions in an intense environment faster?
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting. How did, so wait, are they asking like temperamentally, or how did I create a model that allowed me to do that? That would be kind of two things. I'm going to ask it as I'm going to answer it as a temperamental question. So one of the things that I think is really important to realize is that whenever you're making a decision, if you focus on process, it allows you to get into a part of your brain that's much more rational, as opposed to, say, focusing on the amount of money that I might be risking in a particular hand or what the pressure of the particular situation is. So there was a saying in poker, which is poker is one long game. And what that meant is that any given situation you're in, whether it's like high stakes or low stakes or whatever, is just one decision that you're going to make among thousands and thousands and thousands over the course of your life. And the goal is not to worry so much about one particular decision in a high stakes situation works out. It's, are you making great decisions across all the decisions that you're making? Are you constantly improving? Are you a lifelong learner? Are you open-minded? Are you paying attention to what your opponents are doing so that you can update your models? And then become a better predictor of your opponent's actions over the course of the long run. And I think that that's what ended up really training me to be able to handle those high stress situations, because I really thought about it as just one decision among thousands that I would make in my life in many, many situations over the course of my life. And one of the reasons that works well is neurological, because the emotional part of your brain isn't good at making decisions, but the rational part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex right here, is really good at making decisions. And when you're thinking in that long run, it allows you to stay in the rational part of your brain better. And I think that that's just really important, is that you need to understand, like, over the course of your business life, whatever your role is at an organization, or over the course of your personal life, the goal is to make decisions that make will create a higher probability of better outcomes over the course of your life, and not get too cued in on one single decision, because it is one of many. And I know that that's really hard to internalize when you're saying, but this one's really high stakes. It's like, but you're going to make lots of high stakes decisions. Focus on the process. So, I mean, I don't know, hopefully people will be able to implement that. I know it's probably easier said than done. It took me a lot of practice.
No, that's great. Thanks, Annie. Thanks, Michael. I think we're at the top of the hour, and there's a few more questions we could go over, but let's follow up with folks afterwards. So thank you both for the conversation. For everyone attending, this session was recorded and we'll send out afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.